was society changing in the 19th century? Because the 19th century is commonly referred to as the age of the middle class because of the Industrial Revolution and the shift in classes that we see as a result of that. More liberal governments coming to power, which would have been more driven by the middle class. So why did the 19th century lead to the rise of the middle class? So like the 60 years before World War One, in the late 19th century, is really referred to as the age of the middle class. The middle class was extremely wealthy, but also extremely diverse. So some were extremely wealthy and some were barely getting by. The majority were comfortable, small entrepreneurs and professional people, kind of like what we have today. These people could afford various consumer goods and they could afford to educate their children. So La Belle Époque, the beautiful era, some of the characteristics, which is kind of goes into this rise of the middle class. Some of the characteristics of this was materialism. So in general, people began to have a higher standard of living. Even the working class began to have a higher standard of living because of the Industrial Revolution and the availability of consumer goods that weren't there before. But we also start to see different development zones. So your inner zone, Britain, France, Germany, Belgium, Northern Italy, and Western Austria. These are the areas that were the most developed in Europe. Your outer zone, Ireland, the Iberian Peninsula, which would be Spain and Portugal, the rest of Italy, Europe east of Germany. These areas were industrialized, but not as industrialized, still more agricultural and agrarian, and not nearly as developed as the inner zone. And then you have the completely underdeveloped zone at this point, which would be Afro-Eurasia, which is not moving into an industrial revolution yet, mostly because they're under imperialism. But we also see during this time that the population of Europe is going to increase dramatically. So there's going to be a large growth of cities and urban life. And because of this population increase, we're going to see migration from Europe. So this is like when we start to think of what you learned about in 8th grade with like the beginning of the waves of immigration to the United States. And if you are of European ancestry and your family didn't come here more recently, this is more than likely the time period when your family arrived here in the United States. So between 1850 and 1940, we have about 60 million people leaving Europe. And they went to places like the US, Argentina, Brazil, Canada, and Australia and New Zealand. We also see during this time period the second industrial revolution, where we see a movement towards electricity. We see internal combustion engines, so we start to see cars and planes and submarines begin to develop during this time period as well. In the second industrial revolution, Britain is the world's industrial workshop. So again, Britain is still the center of this industrial revolution, with France and Germany kind of trying to catch up. So we start again, I talked about this with Napoleon III, the creation of limited liability corporations, like when you buy shares in a stock. When you buy shares of stock in a company, you're only responsible for your initial investment. That allows for more investors, allows for the raising of larger amounts of capital, and it allows for the raising of more money with less risk to the various different investors. This is also the age of mass production. We see a movement towards free trade, especially in places like England. We know that's very much the ideas of laissez-faire and the classical economists. We start to see the creation of world markets and the advance of democracy, as we see the working class getting more of the right to vote, which we're going to talk about, in particular with Britain this week. And we also see the creation of the modern welfare state in England, or in Europe, I should say, in general, which is kind of relating to what we see in a lot of these countries today in Europe. So because of this, the middle class could afford more consumer goods. They can afford education. And we have what are referred to as the lower middle class, are usually referred to as white collar workers. And that means they were mostly secretaries, retail clerks, lower level bureaucrats working in the government. And many of these white collar workers would have had working class origins. And so we do see more of a social mobility than what we have seen in the past. So people were able to make the jump from the working class into at least the lower middle class. And then from there, their families could make, in future generations, further leaps. Many of these Lower middle class white collar workers may belong to unions. And because they had these middle class aspirations and they wanted to basically distance themselves from the working class and kind of distinguish themselves more as middle class. So they would have pursued education and chances for career advancement, not only for themselves, but also for their children. And they would have spent a lot of their consumable income on consumer goods. So income beyond, paying for your rent and paying for food. But there was a lot of tension and social anxiety between the relations between these various middle class groups. The lower middle class, not fully accepted by the upper middle class, and the lower middle class very much sees themselves different from the, different from the working class. So how did the rise of the middle class result in what we refer to as a cult of domesticity? So there was a distinction between work and family that very much becomes defined by gender during this time period in the middle class, which then becomes the model for all social groups. So when we talk about traditional gender roles, this is where we really begin to see this develop. Middle class women did not work. Working class women worked. They worked in the factories. They were domestic servants. They contributed very much to the economy of the family. Middle class women did not work. They were limited to the roles of wife and mother. And they would enjoy domestic luxury. They lived a much more comfortable life, but their talents and their intelligence was very much marginalized. And home was seen to be something that was very different from the workplace, which is kind of ironic right now because in the world we're living in right now, home is our workplace. But it was to be a refuge. Home was to be a refuge for the husband from the workplace. And this idea was popularized by women's journals. In the first half of the 19th century, a middle class wife would contribute directly to the business. And she would be an economic partner with the husband, especially if the husband ran a small business. The woman would definitely be there helping out. But now, as we go into the later of the 19th century, that begins to shift. In the first half of the 19th century, women actually did very little of raising their children because they were busy helping their husband run the business. Often they would leave their children to be raised by nurses. Over time, men began to insist upon doing business with other men, and we see this shift towards this cult of domesticity. So magazines and books for women would praise motherhood, domesticity, religion, and charity. Those are the proper work for women. And it was something that was a distinction for a man to be able to say that his wife does not have to work. That says a lot about his own economic status. So the less work your wife does, the higher your status is. And marriages amongst the upper middle class were arranged for economic development. And romantic marriage was seen as a danger to social stability. So a lot of these marriages would have been arranged by their parents. Women married typically at about 21, the latest, and they were expected to have children within the first year of marriage. And the rearing and nurturing of children became their main task, and women really were not trained for anything else. They were trained to oversee the management of their household and to raise their children. So a middle-class woman in the 19th century symbolized her father's success and then her husband's success. So again, the less meaningful work she does, the more prestige and position her husband has. So women were expected to do things like attend church, oversee the religious instruction of their children, participate in some type of charity, but they were not expected to actually do any other work. And again, if the family was able to hire servants and the woman actually didn't even have to do any of the housework, that would seen even as a better reflection of the husband's success and wealth. So we see, though, during this time period, hold on, I'm sorry, why is this, this thing is, we see during this time period, sorry, you couldn't really see it, that the middle class as a percentage of the world's total population actually begins to rise during this time period. So now we're also going to shift topics a little bit, in some ways kind of going full circle, at least with AP World, because we were talking about the Holocaust in AP World just a week or two ago. How were Jews gaining more rights at this time? So during this time period, we're starting to see the emancipation of the European Jewish population from the ghetto. So prior to this, now not talking about like Holocaust ghettos, ghetto, that term ghetto just means Jewish neighborhood. And for the most part, because the Jewish people of Europe were always kind of seen as someone different or ostracized for the rest of the general community, many times they lived in a separate section of the city that would be referred to as the ghetto. But what we start to see in the 18th into the 19th century is we start to see that Jewish people begin to get equal citizenship and social status. And this was seen as a major accomplishment of political liberalism, because liberalism very much focuses on a secular government. So therefore, they would not support the idea of discriminating against people based on religion, and would not support the idea that different groups of people don't get to have full citizenship. So in 1782, Joseph II, who was a Habsburg emperor, he made the decree that put Jews under the same laws as Christians. And that was seen as a pretty radical thing when it happened, because there used to be separate sets of laws in many countries. In a lot of instances, Jewish people weren't allowed to own land, and there was different restrictions placed upon them. In 1789 in France, the National Assembly recognized the Jewish people of France as full French citizens. And during the Napoleonic Wars, Jews in Italy and Germany were allowed to mix equally with the Christian population, which was not normal prior to this. So these steps towards emancipation were always kind of unsure. They were always a little bit on shaky ground, and it would change with different rulers. Even where they had political rights, in many instances, they still could not own land. And in some instances, they still had to pay special taxes. Now, in Russia, which has one of the largest Jewish populations in Europe, the prejudice and the discrimination continues until World War I. So in Russia, Jewish people were treated as aliens under Russian rule. Publication of Jewish books were limited, and Jewish people were restricted as to where they may live. They had to carry around internal passports, even though they were traveling within Russia. They were banned from any type of state service, and in many instances, they were excluded from higher education. And the police in Russia were allowed to conduct pogroms, which are essentially an organized riot against Jewish neighborhoods. And I've mentioned this in AP World. So basically, without any warning, at any given moment, the Russian troops are going to kind of roll into your town and have an organized riot, beat people up, burn some places down, steal things. And they did this on purpose to never allow the Russian Jews to have any sense of stability and comfort, because you never knew when this axe was going to fall and there was going to be a pogrom in your village. After the revolutions of 1848, we do see a general improvement in places like Germany, Italy, the Low Countries, which is the Netherlands, and Scandinavia, where in many instances they gained full citizenship. After 1858, Jews in Great Britain were allowed to sit in Parliament, and a prime minister of Great Britain, who was going to be a pretty prominent prime minister in the 19th century, is a man by the name of Benjamin Disraeli, and he clearly had Jewish ancestry. Between 1850 to 1880, there was no overt prejudice against Jewish people. In Eastern Europe and in Russia, you still saw anti-Semitism, and many Jewish people migrated west to escape that anti-Semitism that was much stronger in Eastern Europe. But in Western Europe, we do see still some levels of personal discrimination against the Jewish people. And in the last 2 decades of the 19th century, anti-Semitism began to grow again. And a lot of this was attributed to a poor economy, because the economy was becoming very stagnant. And that poor economy was blamed on Jewish bankers and their other financial interests. Now, since Jewish people could not own land, very commonly they became merchants, or they went into banking, and then that made them a target. So in the 1880s, we see organized anti-Semitism occurring in places like Germany, and as well as France, in relation to something referred to as the Dreyfus Affair, which I'm going to go into much more greater detail in a second because it was a pretty big deal. But many Jewish people felt that these attacks were temporary reoccurrences, basically, of the older prejudice, and felt overall that they would remain safe in Europe. Unfortunately, they were very, very wrong. But so the Dreyfus Affair. So in 1894, a list of French military documents were found in a wastebasket of the German embassy in Paris. And the French counterintelligence suspected Captain Alfred Dreyfus, who was from a wealthy Alsatian Jewish family. So remember, Alsace-Lorraine is that region in between France and Germany that kind of goes back and forth. And he was one of the few Jews on the general staff of the government. So there's these French military documents found in the German embassy. So Dreyfus is accused. He was tried, he was convicted of treason, and he was sent to Devil's Island in French Guiana. But the real culprit was Major Esterhazy, whose handwriting was the same as that on this bordereau, which was this cachet of documents. The government tried him and found him not guilty in 2 days. So it becomes clear over time that a lot of the reasons why Dreyfus is targeted and Dreyfus is convicted is because he was Jewish. So the Dreyfus Affair is what this becomes known. So a famous author, Emile Zola, publishes an open letter called J'accuse. He accused the army of a cover-up, and the government actually prosecuted him for libel and found him guilty. And he was sentenced to a year in prison. So he spoke out trying to, speak out against this treatment of Dreyfus, and he was thrown in prison himself. And there was all of this very, images like this of Dreyfus the traitor and Dreyfus being hung. So there was a lot of vitriol and anger being directed at Dreyfus, even though he wasn't the person who did this. So Dreyfus finally gets a new trial in 1899. He was brought back from Devil's Island. He was white-haired. He was broken. And after all of this, he was found guilty again. So this other person is the person who did it. That person was found not guilty. Dreyfus gets a new trial. He's still found guilty, even though he is innocent. Now, he eventually was given a presidential pardon and was exonerated in 1906. And then he actually goes on to serve in World War I after all of this. And he dies in 1935. Now, this really ripped the country apart. You had people who supported Dreyfus, and you had people that were against Dreyfus. You had, they were referred to as Dreyfusads versus the anti-Dreyfusads. It really ripped the country apart. And it made people like this man here, Theodor Herzl, really become concerned about this question of if Jews ever really could be safe in Europe. So Herzl was motivated by the Dreyfus trial. He was an Austrian journalist. And so he writes the book, The Jewish State, in 1896, and he creates the first Zionist council in Basel, Switzerland. And so this idea of Zionism is this idea that there should be a Jewish state and that all Jews should live in this Jewish state. And he's going to become a big person who's going to support this idea of an Israel, of a state for the Jewish people, which is really not going to come to fruition until after World War II. So we can see this anti-Semitism, even though things were getting much better for the Jewish people as a whole, at least in Western Europe, there was definitely still this anti-Semitism that was beneath the surface and at times would flare up in these very big ways. So the last question, how did the government try to improve the housing of the poor? So during this time period, the dwellings of the poor were eventually considered public health hazards. We've talked about this in AP World, about how poor the conditions were. Remember, we did that reading towards the middle of the year from Frederick Engels, where he kind of describes what it was like, the working class, the homes of the working class in Manchester, and they really were just like these like dirt floor, almost like hovels. So the middle class was shocked by this living arrangement of the poor, where you would have large families living under one roof with no privacy and only one toilet facilities for the whole block, especially because women were expected to engage in more charitable operations. This was becoming more apparent. Middle class women, I should say. So there was a discontent. There was belief that you have all these people in these overcrowded, squalid conditions. This is going to lead to political discontent. So private donations began to elevate the housing problems, and companies would make low interest loans to the working class. And public authorities began to build housing projects to make life a little bit better for the lower classes. By 1914, the housing problem had been reorganized and it had been addressed, in which homes were provided for the working class. The idea was to allow them to enjoy family life similar to the middle class. And so you would have a detached house or an apartment with several rooms, your own entrance, your own toilet facilities. And the idea being, if you gave people a better place to live, they would be less likely to want to revolt in some way or form, shape, or form against the government. So how would you describe the 19th century European society? And what do you think would be the most important themes for the society?